Hi, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you today in this important discussion around corruption in Southeast Asia. So my main task is to do the opening presentation on corruption in our region. Okay, so I titled it Understanding Corruption in Southeast Asia, a Journalist's Lens. So just a bit of disclaimer, I don't claim to be an expert on the extent and how the issue of corruption plays out in the whole of Southeast Asia. But from what I have seen, and as an investigative journalist, and also in my former role as regional editor for some media publications in Asia, I think I've seen enough of how corruption plays out in the region. But I'll be drawing on my experience as a former investigative journalist with the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, or PCIJ, in the Philippines. Yeah. Okay. Let me provide a bit of a backdrop to one of the things I wish to highlight in my short presentation. The Bureau of Internal Revenue in the Philippines, which is the BIR, it's the top tax collecting arm, or the main tax collecting arm of the Philippine government, is one of the most corrupt agencies in the country. So many years ago, up until I released my series of reports, it was a 3-part series on the BIR. There were a lot of rumors circulating around the extravagant lifestyles of many tax revenue officials, and I thought it was high time we did the report about this issue, mainly to shed some light on what's really going on in the region and why the BIR, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, was considered one of the most corrupt. Actually, it's one of the most corrupt agencies in the Philippines. One of which, the other being the Bureau of Customs. Okay, so my report. The 3-part series was titled BIR officials Amass Unexplained Wealth. It took me at least 6 months to do the research. I had with me a team of researchers who helped me obtain some of the voluminous documents I needed to be able to determine the unexplained wealth of the alleged unexplained wealth of many BIR officials. So I looked into the houses, the fleet of expensive vehicles, business interests of at least 25 BIR officials and employees. In the Philippines, civil servants earn a modest income. Compared to the private sector, they earn significantly less. So it's always a red flag when a public official or a public employee is known to have expensive vehicles, for example, or a big house in some posh subdivision or village in the Philippines. So I looked into this, and then so what came out was that many of the officials I investigated, even after I obtained their statement of assets, for example, could not explain adequately how they acquired their assets, including shares in businesses and companies. And we found out also that BIR postings are so lucrative that many of them would petition a change in their birth records, if only to delay their retirement, which meant the longer they stayed in the Bureau, the more opportunity to generate unexplained wealth. So that's essentially what happened. So in this 3-part report, I wanted to show also to lend credence to the allegations of unexplained wealth, but at the same time explain to the reading public how systemic corruption within the Bureau became possible. What were the breakdowns, for example, in the systems of checks and balances that made corruption in the Bureau? So the 3-part series that I wrote for PCIJ concluded by looking at the breakdown in the systems of checks and balances in the BIR, the lack of transparency, the lack of oversight and accountability, all of which contributed to making the Bureau one of the most corrupt government agencies in the Philippines. Now, I highlighted some phrases here: systems of checks and balances, lack of transparency, because these were reflective of how corruption essentially was taking place in the Philippines. In other government institutions, there were also similar flaws. The absence of checks and balances, or even if they were in place, they were not really being implemented. The lack of transparency is not unique to the BIR, but also applies to other government agencies in the Philippines. For example, later on I looked into the local government units. For example, in one of the biggest cities in the Philippines, or one of the wealthiest in terms of revenue being generated by businesses. But I found out similar flaws: the lack of transparency, the lack of oversight, the lack of accountability. I would say that what I saw in the BIR when I did this story, again, this is not unique to the Bureau, this is not unique to the Philippines, but elsewhere in Southeast Asia, there are similar challenges taking place: the absence of checks and balances, the lack of transparency, the lack of oversight and accountability. Among the most common forms of corruption in the Philippines that I think also applies elsewhere in Southeast Asia are bribery and facilitation payments, fraud, favoritism and undue influence, nepotism, extortion, conflict of interest, to name a few. Even these days, we see these kinds of corruption taking place. For example, fraud has been leveled against the Department of Health in the procurement of medical supplies for frontline health workers. Now, moving into Southeast Asia, I mean, looking more broadly at the region, it's interesting that notwithstanding the massive spread of corruption in our region, there are supposedly systems that are in place. There are anti-corruption agencies, for example, across the region. You have this in Cambodia, there's one in Indonesia, there's another in Malaysia, the Malaysia Anti-Corruption Commission, even Myanmar. The Philippines, on top of other government units, has the Presidential Anti-Corruption Commission. Singapore has the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau. Thailand has the National Counter-Corruption Commission. And even Vietnam, the Steering Committee for Anti-Corruption. I tried and checked Laos, but I couldn't find any similar institutions. Now, similar to the Philippines, I think this is a fitting metaphor at the time when we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Corruption is a chronic disease with deep roots. For example, one study showed that as far back as the early 2000s, 3 of the countries in Southeast Asia, the Philippines being one of them, so the others being Indonesia and Thailand, ranked among the most corrupt countries in the world based on several indices. And at the time, these had been going on for the last 3 or 4 decades. So I thought that's very interesting. And even when you look at what was taking place during the period 80s and 90s, when the democracies were supposedly robust in the region, there were expectations that, given the state of democracy at that time, there should have been a significant drop in corruption. But what they found out was contrary to what was expected. One study noted, for example, that notwithstanding the economic liberalization that was experienced many years back, like in terms of the reduction of trade and investment barriers, the reduced government intervention in the economy, there were expectations of reduced corruption, because then businesses no longer needed to pay bribes to be allowed to operate. Yet, despite this, at that time, there was no discernible fall in corruption. So really, corruption in Southeast Asia has been going on for decades. Now, more recently, going by one of the one of the studies that came out, this is a survey. According to the UNDP, 3 out of 4 millennials in Asia, including our region, of course, believe corruption and poor governance are holding their countries back from social, political, and economic progress, meaning corruption has its adverse impacts, as we all know. Within our region, about 8 in 10 of business leaders recognize corruption as a major challenge for their business operations. Now, this particular finding takes on greater significance at this time, for example, when there's massive unemployment because business companies have shut down, and if there's corruption and they're not able to operate as they should, then it also impacts their ability to hire more people. So it's really like a domino effect. Now, in terms of public procurement in Southeast Asia, similar to what I found out when I did another series of studies looking into the state of procurement at the local government unit level, Southeast Asia is one of the worst performers when it comes to publishing relevant public procurement documents in terms of procurement plans, tender documents, award notice on government websites. In the Philippines, we have a law on procurement that mandates government agencies to practice transparency, like in the conduct of bids, for example, but still, procurement is a major problem. As I mentioned earlier, the procurement of medical supplies amid the pandemic is a major scandal now in the Philippines. The Senate, for example, has just concluded its investigation and I think it has already released a report, and the public has been enraged, by this kind of situation, because our health workers, for example, have been clamoring for increased salaries, for the release of their promised benefits that to this day has not been given. So really, this is the extent of corruption we're seeing in specific parts of our region. Now, in terms of the freedom of information laws, how many countries in Southeast Asia have the FOI law? I know that Thailand has, the Philippines still has none. Even if for 3 decades, the FOI bill has been pending in Congress. And this is very valuable because it allows the media, for example, to access important documents. So these are some indications of corruption in the region. Now, if we would recall some of the biggest corruption scandals that have rocked our region in Malaysia prior to the IMDb fiasco, there was the Port Klang scandal, for example. In Indonesia, on the electronic ID system, the EKTP scheme. We remember this story by Cambodia Daily, which was shut down, I think, in 2018, still taking a cut involving the military. Now, in the Philippines, during the administration of President Joseph Estrada, one of the scandals that hit his administration was, the string of expensive or mansions that he had for his mistresses that the PCIJ exposed through its series of reports, and that helped lead to the fall of President Estrada. Now, it's not surprising to see this kind of numbers by the Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index in Southeast Asia for 2020, which was released earlier this year. Of the 10 countries in the ASEAN regional bloc, only Singapore is listed among the clean countries with 85 out of an index score of 100. Malaysia is performing relatively better, but all the rest, Timor-Leste, all the way down to Cambodia, which is the highest corruption the poorest ranking. Everybody else except for Singapore is performing very poorly in terms of perceptions of the incidence of corruption in these specific parts of the region. Now, if we look at the state of democracy in different parts of the region, based on the Freedom House report, its latest 2021 showed that only 4 countries are partly free. only one is free, Timor-Leste, and the rest are not free, namely Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now, what does this say in terms of, how, in terms of the state of governance in the region? Now, it's I it would be interesting to see the correlation, of course, between the state of democracy and the extent of corruption, whether it's correlation or causation, for example, in the Southeast Asian region. But it's hard to tackle corruption without looking at the state at the same time at the state of governance and the state of democracy, or what's left of it in in our region. It's very interesting, for example, that my own country, the Philippines, had the people power revolution that toppled democracy and that raised a lot of expectations in terms of better governance, a cleaner government, for example. But where are we today? We're still one of the most corrupt countries, not just in Asia, but in the world. So I think the same can be said of other parts of the region, including Indonesia. Now, if you talk about turning the tide of corruption in the region, of course, there have been efforts to curb corruption, particularly by civil society. Laws have been passed to address corruption. But of course, well, as we would sometimes say, these are more honored in the bridge rather than in the observance. So the widespread corruption in the region does not mean that there are no systems in place to curb corruption, but how are they being implemented? For example, it's interesting that one author writing for the UNDP site said, standalone solutions do not work. We need to effectively address the multifaceted nature of corruption through systemic solutions that involve multiple actors. And this brings me back to what I was pointing out earlier. Working as an investigative journalist and being conscious of the extent of corruption in the Philippines, I was mindful of not just exposing the corrupt officials, but also helping the public to understand where the flaws were, why corruption is taking place in the first place, and why there's been a lot of difficulty in trying to stop corruption in my country. And this brings me to, I'd like to share a bit about the value of investigative journalism. Maybe true enough, standalone solutions, according to this author, for example, would not be enough. But how about one investigative story at a time? It's interesting to note that our stories, especially in-depth investigative type, help raise the level of discourse, understanding among the public in terms of the incidence of corruption. Why is there so much corruption in the procurement system, for example, in how environmental regulations are being implemented? The public needs to understand this, and I'm a firm believer in the role of a journalist in elevating the level of discourse around such important issues. Well, but we're well aware that in the past several years, the state of repression in Southeast Asia has been intensifying, and we're seeing that even in the midst of the pandemic. As has often been said, been written about, the pandemic has been used as a pretext to clamp down on civil liberties, on fundamental rights. And this includes, press freedom, the ability of the media to expose and really generate thorough understanding of what's going on and hold our public officials to account. But interestingly enough, the more repressive our environment is, the more there's a need for these kinds of issues to be brought to the fore, to be explained in a way that the public will understand. Of course, there are challenges, especially these days, in doing, in bringing to light the specific incidents of corruption in our respective countries. there have been severe consequences for journalists looking into specific issues, such as this story, for example, would show. We remember the two Myanmar journalists from Reuters. We know, of course, what happened to Maria Ressa, whose news publication, the online news site Rappler, has exposed a number of situations relating to governance in the Philippines, in particular the so-called drug war of President Duterte, resulting in her being charged, for example, with being slapped with not just one, but several libel cases. This is part of a series on impunity in the Philippines in relation to the drug campaign of the anti-drug campaign of Duterte. Some people need killing, people dying left and right in the course of the so-called war on drugs. So there are really, severe consequences. But the more the government, I would say, as a former investigative journalist and now as a journalist, of course, the more crackdown, the more intensifying the crackdown is, I think the more people need to understand what's going on. Even during the pandemic, we're seeing a sharp decline in fundamental freedoms, including press freedom. There are many important issues that need to be brought to light, but journalists are being hampered from doing that. But it's interesting to note that in Southeast Asia, we have a strong investigative reporting tradition, at least in some parts. We've seen the setting up of investigative journalism centers. Indonesia has, for example, has Jaring. Myanmar, I don't know if this is still operational. I checked their Facebook page. The last post was in 2019. But the Philippine Center, but PCIJ is still very active. There's the Thailand Information Center for Civil Rights and Investigative Journalism, and other media outlets in our region really doing commendable work in terms of exposing corruption. There's Frontier Myanmar, New Narrative, Malaysia Kini, of course, the independent outlet, the alternative outlet, Prachutai, of course, Rappler, the defunct Cambodia Daily, to name a few. I think this reflects on the courage of journalists in the region to really not just do the usual reporting, but really produce more in-depth and investigative pieces for the public to be aware of what's going on. Very quickly, not all reporting is investigative reporting, of course. Some is merely reactive. I think when it comes to corruption, it's very important that there are more efforts being exerted toward investigative reporting to bring what is otherwise hidden from public view to light. And this brings me to one thing that I want to highlight because of the repressive environment in which many journalists in the region are operating that makes it difficult for them to put out very important reports. I think this is time. It's high time that we had more collaborative efforts, especially along the lines of investigative journalism. In Indonesia, there's been considerable efforts, particularly by Tempo, for example. Even Thailand, there's been a push by some investigative journalists toward cross-border collaboration. Pandora Paper, which exposed our own leaders in the region, including the very influential ones within the region, in terms of their investments or financial holdings outside of their respective countries, is an example of collaborative effort. Now, I want to highlight that when it comes to exposing corruption and getting the public to understand how corruption is taking place, why it matters to them, why solving it may not immediately bring food to their table, I think it's the role of investigative journalism is not just in terms of raising awareness, getting people to be informed, but it's really to engage people in the business of public governance, and where needed, to enrage people, because this corruption in the region is not something to take lightly or to take sitting down. This very interesting statement by Sheila Coronel, one of the founders of PCIJ and who's now with Columbia University School of Journalism. This holds a lot of relevance for our work as journalists, and in particular for investigative journalists. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires the active participation of citizens in the business of governance by informing, educating, and mobilizing the public. And I think stories that expose corruption, that explain to the public how corruption takes place, achieves this. It informs them, it educates them, and it mobilizes people to action. So overall, I would say that corruption is also, as much as it's a big challenge for us, it also presents opportunities, especially for more collaborative efforts in the area of investigative journalism. It's something that we need to be taking a closer look at in terms of what kinds of stories can we put out, and the public needs to understand, especially at a time when we're bombarded with a lot of disinformation. And I end on that note. Thank you very much.